The morning sun painted golden streaks across the sky as Alexander Reed's sleek black car rolled into Maplewood. It had been 15 long years since he last saw these familiar streets. Now at 32, with billions in his bank account and a tech empire under his command, he barely recognized the town that shaped his childhood. Alexander gripped the steering wheel tighter as he turned onto Oak Lane. His mother's passing 3 weeks ago had forced this journey home, a trip he'd avoided for too long. The car slowed as he approached the modest 2-story house where he grew up. It looked smaller now, the blue paint faded, the front porch sagging slightly. With a deep breath, he stepped out of the car. The neighbors' curtains twitched. Of course they recognized him. His face had been on magazine covers and news websites whenever Reed Innovations launched another groundbreaking product. But here, he wasn't the tech genius or the billionaire. Here, he was just Mary Reed's son, finally home to say goodbye. The house smelled like his mother's lavender candles. Alexander moved through the room slowly, memories flooding back with each step. In the attic, while sorting through old boxes, his fingers brushed against something unexpected, a small wooden chest with a heart carved on top. "I can't believe she kept this," he whispered, carefully opening the lid. Inside lay the treasures of his youth, photographs of 2 gap-toothed kids laughing by a creek, handwritten notes passed during class, and a faded friendship bracelet woven from blue and green threads. Each item connected to one person. Eliza Carter, the girl next door, his first love. Alexander sat back against a dusty trunk, holding a photo of Eliza on her 12th birthday. Her dark curls framed a face sprinkled with freckles, a smile wide and true, as she blew out candles on a homemade cake. They had promised each other forever back then, with the innocent confidence only children possess. "What happened to us, Liz?" he murmured. His stomach growled, pulling him from memories. Alexander decided to grab lunch in town, curious about what remained of the Maplewood he once knew. Main Street had changed less than he expected. The hardware store was now a coffee shop, but Gina's bakery still stood on the corner, the smell of fresh bread spilling onto the sidewalk. Alexander pushed the door open, the little bell announcing his arrival. He was studying the menu board when the bakery door jingled again. Lost in thought, Alexander turned without looking and collided with someone. Hot coffee splashed across his expensive shirt. "I'm so sorry," a woman's voice gasped. "It's fine, don't worry about." The words died in his throat as he looked up. Time seemed to stop. Though 15 years had passed, he would know that his eyes anywhere, warm brown with flecks of gold, now widened in shock. "Alexander?" Eliza Carter stood before him, a stack of papers clutched to her chest, coffee dripping from her now empty cup. She looked different, her curls tamed into a practical ponytail, fine lines at the corners of her eyes, but something essential remained unchanged. "Eliza," he managed. "I didn't know. I mean, I hoped you might still be in town, but—" She seemed frozen, emotions flickering across her face too quickly to read. "Your mother's funeral, that's why you're back." Alexander nodded. "I just arrived this morning." An awkward silence stretched between them, 15 years of unspoken words filling the space. "Miss Carter." A small voice called from near the counter. "Can I get a chocolate cookie?" Alexander watched as a young girl, maybe 8 years old, bounded up to Eliza. The child had the same dark curls, the same freckles across her nose. "In a minute, Sophie," Eliza said softly, her eyes never leaving Alexander's face. "First, I want you to meet someone. This is an old friend of mine." Sophie studied him with curious eyes. "You spilled Mom's coffee." Alexander laughed, tension breaking. "I did. I owe her a new cup and probably a cookie too." "And who turns down cookies?" Eliza said, a hint of the old warmth returning to her voice. "We have time for coffee if you'd like to catch up. I'm on my lunch break from the school. I teach kindergarten now." Alexander looked at Eliza, the girl he once knew, now a mother and teacher, someone whose life had continued perfectly well without him. Yet something pulled at him. A chance to understand what might have been, what still might be. "I'd like that," he said simply. "I'd like that very much." Alexander and Eliza sat across from each other at a corner table in Gina's bakery. Sophie had wandered to the display case, nose pressed against the glass as she carefully considered her cookie options. "So, Alexander began, wrapping his hands around his coffee mug. Kindergarten teacher. You always did have a way with kids. Eliza smiled, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. It's not what I planned, but I love it. 25 little ones who think I hang the moon and stars. And Sophie? Alexander asked carefully, watching the little girl who was now chatting with the baker. Something flickered in Eliza's eyes, a mix of pride and pain. She's everything to me. Smart, kind, stubborn as her mother. Her father? The question hung in the air. Eliza took a sip of her replacement coffee before answering. Tom left when Sophie was 3. Said small-town life wasn't for him. She shrugged with practiced casualness. We manage fine without him. Alexander noticed the slight tremor in her hands, the worn edges of her sweater, the careful way she'd ordered the cheapest item on the menu. You're working at the community center too, right? Someone mentioned it when I was handling Mom's paperwork. Weekends, Eliza nodded. Teaching art classes. The pay helps with rent. She gestured toward the ceiling. We live above the bookstore down the street. It's small, but it's home. The stark contrast between their lives hit Alexander like a physical blow. While he worried about stock prices and corporate takeovers, Eliza counted pennies to keep a roof over her daughter's head. And you? Eliza asked, her eyes taking in his designer watch, the tailored suit now stained with coffee. Raid Innovations is everywhere. You did exactly what you always said you would. Alexander shifted uncomfortably. The company's done well. Better than I expected. That's quite the understatement, Eliza laughed. Last I checked, doing well doesn't usually include private islands and space rockets. It's just money, he said quietly. Says the billionaire, Eliza teased, but there was no malice in her voice. You live in California now, right? A penthouse in San Francisco. Views of the bay. As he said it, Alexander realized how hollow it sounded. But I'm hardly there. Tokyo one day, London the next. The board keeps me busy. Sophie bounded back to their table, chocolate smeared on her cheek. Mom, can Alexander come see my science project? It's about butterflies, and I got an A+. Honey, I'm sure Alexander has important business to take care of. I'd love to, Alexander interrupted, if that's okay with your mom. The walk to Eliza's apartment revealed more about her life than any conversation could. She greeted everyone by name, the mail carrier, the grocery store clerk, an elderly man walking his dog. Each time, Sophie would proudly announce, "This is Alexander, Mom's friend from when she was little." Their apartment was exactly as Alexander had pictured, small but filled with life. Bookshelves lined the walls, mismatched furniture crowded the living room, and Sophie's artwork covered the refrigerator. It was nothing like his minimalist penthouse where decorators had selected every piece for aesthetic value rather than meaning. It's not much, Eliza said, hurriedly picking up scattered toys. If I'd known I was having company. It's perfect, Alexander said, meaning it. While Sophie showed him her butterfly collection, Eliza stepped away to make a phone call. Alexander couldn't help overhearing her tense conversation. Yes, I know the rent is late again. I get paid Friday. Please, just 3 more days. When she returned, her smile didn't reach her eyes. Work stuff, she said, noticing his concerned expression. That evening, as Alexander drove back to his mother's empty house, his mind raced. His phone beeped with messages from his assistant about urgent meetings and contracts worth millions. But all he could think about was Eliza's worn sweater and Sophie's bright eyes. The life he built suddenly felt meaningless compared to the genuine warmth in that tiny apartment. In his hotel room later, Alexander opened his laptop and searched for information about Maplewood's community center. The building needed repairs, programs were being cut, and funding had dried up. Without hesitation, he made an anonymous donation large enough to save it. It wasn't charity, he told himself. It was investment in something that actually mattered. For the first time in years, Alexander fell asleep thinking not of business deals, but of a pair of warm brown eyes with flecks of gold and the life he'd left behind 15 years ago. Days turned into weeks as Alexander found more and more reasons to delay his return to San Francisco. Just need to sort through Mom's belongings, he told his increasingly frustrated assistant over the phone. In truth, he'd finished that task days ago. Saturday morning found him at Maplewoods Community Center, rolling up the sleeves of his designer shirt as he helped set up for Eliza's art class. The old building had seen better days, water stains marked the ceiling, and the heating system clanked ominously. "You really don't have to do this," Eliza said, arranging paintbrushes at each table. "Don't billionaires have people for manual labor?" Alexander laughed as he unfolded another table. "I do own shirts that don't cost more than your rent, you know." "Could have fooled me," she teased, her eyes lingering on him a moment longer than necessary. Children began arriving, Sophie among the first. "Alexander," she squealed, running up to hug his legs. "Are you helping Mom teach today?" "Looks like I'm on brush cleaning duty," he said, ruffling her hair. The next 2 hours reminded Alexander of a simpler time. He watched Eliza in her element, patiently guiding little hands as they created watercolor masterpieces. She glowed with purpose, and Alexander couldn't take his eyes off her. "You're staring," Eliza whispered when she caught him watching. "Just admiring the teacher," he replied, making her blush. After class, Mrs. Wilson, the center's elderly director, pulled Alexander aside. "Such a shame," she sighed. "Next week might be our last. The building needs repairs we can't afford, and the town council's cutting our funding." Alexander nodded sympathetically, knowing his enormous donation would arrive Monday, saving not just the art program, but the entire center. That afternoon, Alexander invited Eliza and Sophie for ice cream at the same shop where he and Eliza had spent countless summer days as kids. "They still have your favorite," Alexander said, pointing to the rocky road. Eliza looked surprised. "You remember that?" "I remember everything," he said softly. Sophie licked her chocolate cone happily, oblivious to the weight of his words. "Mom says you two used to catch frogs at the creek. Can we go there, please?" The creek looked smaller than Alexander remembered, but the flat rocks they used to skip still lined the banks. Sophie raced ahead, hunting for frogs among the reeds. "Be careful near the water," Eliza called. Alexander picked up a smooth stone, turning it over in his palm. "Remember our pact? We carved our initials in that big oak tree and swore we'd always be together." Eliza nodded, gazing across the water. "We were just kids. We didn't know life would take us in different directions." "What happened when I left?" Alexander asked the question that had haunted him for weeks. "My father's scandal, our sudden move. I wrote to you." "I never got any letters," Eliza said, looking genuinely surprised. "After you disappeared, I waited for months. Eventually, I had to move on." Alexander frowned. "I wrote dozens, every week at first." A moment of understanding passed between them as the same thought occurred to both. His mother, trying to protect him from his past, had never sent the letters. "Look," Sophie called, interrupting their moment. "I found one." She held up a tiny green frog, beaming with pride. As the sun began to set, they climbed the hill overlooking town. Another spot from their shared past. Sophie had fallen asleep on the walk back, and Alexander carried her, her small head resting trustingly against his shoulder. "You're good with her," Eliza said quietly. "She makes it easy. She's a lot like you were at that age." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the lights of Maplewood twinkle on in the dusk. "You'll have to go back soon," Eliza said, not a question but a statement of fact. "Your real life is waiting." Alexander looked down at Sophie, then at Eliza, her face softened in the fading light. "I'm not sure that's my real life anymore," he admitted. "I haven't felt this content in years." Eliza began, her voice carrying a warning. "I know, different worlds. But for tonight, can we just pretend those worlds don't matter?" Under the same stars that had witnessed their childhood promises, Alexander felt something long dormant awakening in his heart. His phone buzzed in his pocket, likely another crisis at the company, but for once he let it ring. Tomorrow would bring complications, but tonight, with Sophie's steady breathing and Eliza's hand occasionally brushing against his, Alexander was exactly where he wanted to be. Monday morning arrived with unexpected news. Alexander walked into the community center to find it buzzing with excitement. Mrs. Wilson spotted him and hurried over, eyes bright with tears. "A miracle happened," she exclaimed, clutching his arm. "Someone donated enough money to save the center and fund all our programs for the next 5 years. Nobody knows who, but it must be someone with a big heart." Alexander smiled. That's wonderful news. I'm happy for everyone. Across the room, he caught Eliza's gaze. She was watching him with an odd expression, her head tilted slightly. Before he could approach her, his phone rang, his assistant's special ringtone. "Mr. Reed, the board is demanding your return," his assistant said without preamble. "The Thompson merger is falling apart, and the shareholders are getting nervous. They've called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning." Alexander sighed. "Book me on a flight for tonight." When he looked up, Eliza was gone. He found her in the supply closet, organizing art materials with more force than necessary. "I need to head back to San Francisco," he began. "Business emergency." "Of course," she said, not meeting his eyes. "Your real-world calls." "Eliza, what's wrong? Did I do something?" She turned to face him, a paintbrush clutched in her hand. "It was you, wasn't it? The donation to the center." Alexander hesitated, then nodded. "I wanted to help, but I knew you wouldn't accept it, Ife." "If you offered it directly to me," she finished. "So you went behind my back instead. That's not fair. I wasn't trying to." "Do you know what people are saying?" Eliza's voice trembled. "That I'm after your money. That I engineered our chance meeting. Mrs. Peterson at the grocery store asked if I was planning to redecorate my apartment now that I had a billionaire boyfriend." Alexander reached for her hand, but she stepped back. "People talk in small towns. They'll find something new to gossip about soon." "It's not just gossip." Eliza pulled out her phone and showed him a news website. There on the screen was a blurry photo of them at the creek with Sophie under the headline, "Tech Billionaire's Secret Family? Reed spotted with mystery woman and child in hometown." Alexander felt sick. "I'm so sorry. I'll have my PR team handle this." "Your PR team?" Eliza laughed without humor. "This is my life, Alexander. Not a public relations problem." Before he could respond, Sophie burst into the room, clutching a drawing. "Alexander, I made this for you to take on your trip." The colorful picture showed 3 stick figures holding hands. A tall man, a woman with curly hair, and a small girl. Alexander knelt down, forcing a smile. "It's beautiful, Sophie. I'll keep it with me always." After Sophie skipped away, Eliza spoke quietly. "She's getting attached to you. She asked last night if you were going to be her new dad." The words hung heavy between them. "And what did you tell her?" "That grown-up relationships are complicated," Eliza sighed. "Maybe this was all a mistake. You'll go back to your world of board meetings and billion-dollar deals, and will be a story you tell someday, your small-town adventure." Alexander felt a flash of anger. "Is that what you think this is to me? Some kind of vacation from real life?" "Isn't it?" Her eyes challenged him. "You've been here 3 weeks, playing house in a world that isn't yours, but when your company calls, you're gone without a second thought." "That's not fair." "I have responsibilities." "So do I," Eliza replied. "My responsibility is to protect Sophie from being hurt when you inevitably leave us behind." Alexander's phone buzzed again. His car to the airport was waiting. The timing couldn't have been worse. "I have to go," he said, hating the words as they left his mouth. Eliza nodded, her face carefully blank. "Have a safe flight, Alexander." That evening, as his private jet climbed into the clouds, Alexander stared at Sophie's drawing. His luxury surroundings felt empty compared to Eliza's tiny apartment filled with love and laughter. His phone beeped with messages about the merger, stock prices, and media inquiries about the mystery woman. 2 worlds pulling him in opposite directions. For the first time in his successful life, Alexander Reed had no idea what to do. Back in Maplewood, Eliza tucked Sophie into bed. "Will Alexander come back?" the little girl asked sleepily. Eliza kissed her daughter's forehead, blinking back tears. "I don't know, sweetheart. People like Alexander belong in bigger places than Maplewood." "But he seems happier here," Sophie murmured as she drifted off to sleep. "Yes," Eliza whispered. "For a little while he did." The San Francisco skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alexander's penthouse, but he barely noticed the view. For 3 days, he'd been buried in meetings, steering the company through the merger crisis. His body was present, but his mind kept wandering back to Maplewood. "Mr. Reed, did you hear the question?" his CFO had asked, concerned faces staring at him from around the conference table. "Sorry, where were we?" Alexander straightened in his chair, trying to focus. Later that evening, alone in his expansive living room, Alexander opened a box he brought from his mother's house. Inside were the letters, dozens of them, yellowed with age, addressed to Eliza in his teenage handwriting. His mother had never mailed them. He picked up the phone to call Eliza several times but stopped himself. What would he say? That he was sorry? That he missed her? Both were true, but neither addressed the real problem. Their lives existed in completely different worlds. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. His housekeeper appeared with a stack of mail. "This came for you today, sir," marked urgent. Among the business correspondence was a plain envelope with Maplewood's postmark. Inside was a note in unfamiliar handwriting. "Mr. Reed, I'm writing without Eliza's knowledge. When she found out who donated to the center, she was more hurt that you didn't trust her enough to be honest than angry about the money itself. There's something else you should know. In your mother's papers, we found these. Eliza should see them. Mrs. Wilson." Beneath the note were photographs of Alexander and Eliza as children, and something else that made his heart stop. A bundle of letters addressed to Alexander in Eliza's handwriting, all marked "Return to sender." He had never received them because his mother had sent them back. Without hesitation, Alexander called his pilot. "Prepare the jet. I'm going back to Maplewood tonight." It was nearly midnight when he arrived at his mother's house. Unable to sleep, he spent hours reading Eliza's returned letters. In them, she poured out her heart, her confusion when he disappeared, her hurt when he never responded, and eventually, her acceptance that whatever they had was over. At dawn, Alexander walked to the bookstore, sitting on a bench across the street, watching the lights come on in Eliza's apartment above. When she emerged with Sophie for the school run, he stood. "Alexander?" Eliza stopped short, gripping Sophie's hand tighter. "I found something," he said simply, holding up the bundle of her letters. "My mother sent them back." "I never knew you wrote to me." Eliza's face paled. "Where did you get those?" "Mrs. Wilson found them in Mom's things, just like she found these." He held up his own never-sent letters. "I think we both have some reading to do." Sophie broke the tension. "Are you back to stay? You promised to help with my science fair project." "Sophie," Eliza warned, "Alexander has important work." "Actually," he interrupted, "I do have to go back to San Francisco, but not for long. There's something I need to tell you both." Over breakfast at Gina's bakery, Alexander explained why his family had left Maplewood so suddenly 15 years ago. "My father was caught embezzling money from his company. When it was discovered he tried to take his own life." Alexander's voice cracked. "Mom moved us away to escape the scandal. She was trying to protect me, give me a fresh start. That's why she never sent my letters and returned yours. She wanted to cut all ties to this place." Eliza reached across the table, taking his hand. "I'm so sorry. All these years, I thought you just forgot about me." "Never," Alexander said firmly. "Not for one day." After dropping Sophie at school, they walked to the creek, their old special place. Alexander handed Eliza his bundle of letters. "I want you to read these. They're everything I wanted to tell you back then. Alexander, the past is." "I know it's the past," he said, "but I need you to understand who I was before you decide if there's a place for me in your future." Eliza studied his face. "And what about your company, your life in San Francisco?" Alexander took a deep breath. "That's what I have to go back for. Not to stay, but to change things. If you'll give me a chance, I want to build a life that bridges both our worlds." He hadn't planned to say it, but the words felt right. Eliza didn't answer immediately, but she took the letters, her fingers brushing against his. "Read them," he said softly, "then decide." As he turned to leave, Eliza called after him. "Alexander, Sophie's science fair is next Friday." He smiled, understanding her unspoken message. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." The Reed Innovations headquarters buzzed with confusion as Alexander strode through the lobby, ignoring the surprised looks from employees. He hadn't warned anyone about his return, and he certainly hadn't told them about the bombshell he was about to drop. "I need the board assembled in 1 hour," he told his assistant, who scrambled to comply. While waiting, Alexander gazed at the city skyline from his corner office. He'd built this company from nothing, turning a college dorm room idea into a tech empire. It had been his whole life, until Maplewood reminded him of who he was before spreadsheets and stock options consumed his days. The boardroom fell silent as Alexander outlined his plan. I'm restructuring the company. I'll remain as CEO, but with a reduced role. I'm appointing Linda Chen as Chief Operating Officer to handle day-to-day operations. This is absurd. Walter Bishop, the oldest board member, sputtered. You can't run a company of this size part-time from some backwater town. Alexander's voice remained calm. I've made my decision. The papers are already filed. Later, in his penthouse, Alexander began packing, selecting only what truly mattered. His phone rang. It was Eliza. I read your letters, she said softly. Alexander held his breath, and they broke my heart. All those years, thinking you'd forgotten me. I never did, he said. Not once. I know that now. Her voice caught. Alexander, there's something else. Tom called. Alexander froze. Your ex-husband. He saw the tabloid photos. He's coming to town, talking about fighting for partial custody of Sophie. Fear laced her words. He hasn't sent a birthday card in 3 years, but suddenly he's Father of the Year. He's always been jealous and seeing those pictures of you with us. I'll be on the next flight, Alexander promised. He arrived in Maplewood the following afternoon to find Eliza pacing outside her apartment. The worried lines around her eyes deepened when she spotted him. He's taking me to court, she said without preamble. Claims I'm an unfit mother because I work 2 jobs and can't provide Sophie with adequate opportunities. His lawyer called this morning. Alexander's jaw tightened. Let me help. I know the best family attorneys in the country. Eliza's shoulders stiffened. I can't afford expensive lawyers, Alexander. I'll cover it. This isn't charity, Eliza. This is Sophie's future. And then what? Her eyes flashed. I become the poor woman who needed the billionaire to rescue her. I'd fought my own battles for 8 years. Alexander reached for her hand. This isn't about pride. It's about using every resource to protect Sophie. Before Eliza could respond, a dark SUV pulled up. A tall man in an expensive suit stepped out, Tom Carter, looking nothing like the small-town boy Eliza had married. Success had hardened his features, much as it had almost done to Alexander. Well, if it isn't the happy couple Tom called, his smile not reaching his eyes. Nice to finally meet the man who's trying to buy my family. Alexander felt Eliza tense beside him. Tom, please, she said quietly. Not in the street where Sophie might hear. Tom stepped closer. You think I don't know what's happening? You found yourself a rich boyfriend and suddenly decided I'm not good enough to see my own daughter. You decided that 3 years ago, when you stopped calling her, Eliza shut back, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. Things are different now. I've built something for myself. I can give Sophie opportunities you never could. Tom's gaze shifted to Alexander. Unless your new friend is offering to bankroll your life. The accusation hung in the air, voicing Alexander's own unspoken fear that helping Eliza financially would undermine her independence, the very quality he admired most. This isn't about money, Alexander said firmly. This is about Sophie having the stability she deserves. Tom scoffed. Says the man who just flew in from San Francisco. How long before you fly away again? The question struck harder than Alexander expected. He'd been so focused on helping that he hadn't considered how his coming and going affected Eliza and Sophie. After Tom left, promising to see them in court, Eliza sank onto a park bench. Maybe he's right, she whispered. Maybe Sophie would have more opportunities with him. Do you believe that? Alexander asked gently. Eliza shook her head. No. But sometimes I wonder if I'm being selfish, keeping her in this small town, in our tiny apartment, when there could be more for her. Alexander sat beside her, choosing his words carefully. I grew up with more, Eliza. After Mom died, I had everything money could buy and not one person who truly knew me. He took her hand. Sophie has something far more valuable, a mother who would sacrifice anything for her happiness. As dusk fell over Maplewood, they sat in silence, both wondering where the uncertain road ahead might lead them. 3 months had passed since Tom's custody threat. Spring had come to Maplewood, bringing fresh green leaves to the oak trees and wildflowers to the creek banks. In Eliza's small kitchen, the morning light streamed through open windows as Alexander helped Sophie with her homework. If Billy has 12 apples and gives away 5, how many does he have left? Alexander read from the worksheet. Sophie frowned in concentration, counting on her fingers. 7. That's right. Alexander high-fived her, catching Eliza's smile from where she stood at the counter, packing Sophie's lunch. Life had fallen into an unexpected rhythm. The custody battle ended before it truly began, with Tom backing down after a stern talk from Alexander and the formidable lawyer he'd hired for Eliza. Now Alexander split his time between San Francisco and Maplewood, flying back and forth twice a week. It wasn't perfect, but they were making it work. "Don't forget your science book," Eliza reminded Sophie, zipping up her backpack. "And Alexander has a surprise for you after school." Sophie's eyes widened. "What surprise?" Alexander winked. "You'll just have to wait and see." After walking Sophie to the school bus, Alexander and Eliza strolled hand in hand back toward town. The easy comfort between them was new. A bridge carefully built over the past months of honest conversations and shared challenges. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Eliza asked, squeezing his hand. "It's a big step." Alexander nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything." They stopped in front of the old Victorian house at the end of Maple Street. A sold sign swung in the breeze, and workers were busy fixing the sagging porch steps. "It's going to take at least 2 months to make it livable," Alexander said, surveying the peeling paint and overgrown garden. "But I can already see us here." Eliza leaned against him, looking up at the house, not a mansion by his standards, but larger than anywhere she'd ever lived. "I still think we should start smaller. I don't need all this space." "The big backyard is for Sophie," Alexander insisted. "And the extra bedrooms are for—" "For what?" Eliza raised an eyebrow. Alexander's cheeks reddened slightly. "Well, maybe someday if you want more kids." Eliza laughed, a sound that still made his heart skip. "One step at a time, Mr. Reed. We're not even married yet." The word "yet" hung in the air between them, full of promise. Later that afternoon, they met Sophie at the old bookstore beneath Eliza's apartment. Alexander's surprise was revealed. He'd bought the building and wanted to renovate it into a community bookshop and cafe. "And the best part," he told Sophie, who was bouncing with excitement, "is that your mom will run it. No more weekend job at the community center. One job right here in town." Eliza protested. "Alexander, I don't know the first thing about running a bookstore." "You know everything about what this town needs, a place where people can gather, where kids can read, where everyone feels welcome." His faith in her was unwavering. "Besides, I've hired someone to handle the business side. You just pick the books and create the programs." Sophie was already planning where the children's section should go, her voice echoing through the empty space. As evening fell, they sat on the creek bank, their special place. Sophie was at a friend's house for a sleepover, giving them a rare quiet moment together. "I've been thinking," Alexander said, watching the sunset paint the water gold. "About what you said that first day at Gina's bakery. About me belonging in bigger places than Maplewood." Eliza winced. "I was hurt and scared. I didn't mean—" "No, you were right," he interrupted gently. "I did belong in those bigger places. I needed to build something to prove myself, but that journey led me right back here." He took both her hands in his. "To you." Eliza's eyes glistened. "I was so afraid to trust this. To trust you. After Tom left, I built walls around myself and Sophie. I didn't want to need anyone. And now?" She smiled through her